So it has been our tradition to begin somewhere between 4:03 and 4:05. And as we are nearing that midpoint of 4:04, I figured I would go ahead and get us started so that we can use this time. And I'll just keep updating the chat with for anybody that's new coming in as to what it is that we're doing in this first sort of part of the Zoom meeting. Welcome. And again, for those of you guys who are not familiar with FotoFika or any of us, we will do some introductions as we get us started. But I'm Ann Massoni. I'm the Dean of the School of the International Center of Photography, and certainly we welcome you all today. Wanted to start by thanking the Society for Photographic Education, who we remain affiliated with and who has generously offered us their Zoom account for this meeting. We're going to drop their website in the chat in just a moment. Just a reminder that SPE is a membership-based organization and certainly would appreciate your support. For those of you who are new, one of the things that we do like to do here is to collect a separate email list. I promise we're not going to email you with spam and all sorts of things outside of FotoFika, but Alana, who is new with us today, Alana Ward, is going to receive those email addresses from any of you who are new to us. Again, if you've been with us before, we have your contact information. No need to send it. If you have recently changed your contact information and want to send that to Alana, by all means, please feel free to do so. And then again, I think because as Jason reminded us, we do have certain Zoom protocol. We will ask that everybody stays on mute from now until after our guest wraps up. Please do stick around because we have a rather significant informal conversation to have today. And one of the things that would be incredibly helpful for all of you who are here today and your colleagues who were unable to join us, we are thinking about this particular meeting as a part 1 of 2. For all your colleagues who might be particularly interested in what we're getting ready to unfold, please share, encourage them to join us at our next meeting. That said, we are moving to a once-a-month meeting structure, and we will continue to update you all with that. And we have actually updated our calendar on our FotoFika website. And lastly, because I said this for 18 months, I'm going to continue to say it because it still seems so incredibly relevant. We're establishing the way to move forward in this shifting time. And we can certainly do that together. And that certainly is what FotoFika is all about. So welcome. Over to you, John.
Hey, everybody. I'm John Fryer, and I teach at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And we're really excited about this new stage of what FotoFika is going to be doing over the next coming year. One of the things that we talked about at the end of our last session was that we're thinking about ideas of recipes, and it's partially inspired by this really beautiful book called Beaumont's Kitchen, which is Beaumont Newhall's collection of recipes. It's a beautiful book that did Radius Books put this out?
Yes.
Yeah. We were kind of looking at that and thinking about ways that when we are, with all the stuff that was happening in COVID, we were really reacting to a lot of stuff. And we are in a point now, I think, where we have a lot of protocols set up. We have a lot of the content that we're delivering. We're flexible people that have made content that can be delivered in hybrid format and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do is crowdsource a set of recipes for living and for working and for teaching. And we're going to blend both ideas of recipes for conceptual things to recipes for even chemical developers and so on and so forth, to physical to recipes of things that we consume. So we're going to try to keep the introductions on during the coming year to be fairly short so that we get to the guests that we have. Each week we'll have a guest on. And our first guest is Becky Senf, who's the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography. And she did this really amazing project that she's going to talk about called 52 Cakes, right? Is it 52 Cakes? Where I'll let her explain a little bit more, but she went through the process of making a cake a week for a year. And she's going to talk a little bit about why she did that. She's going to share a recipe with us from that process, but also talk about how it impacted her practice as a scholar and as a curator. And it's a way to kind of get us started down the path of the project that we're pursuing over the course of this semester and this entire year. So I'm going to hand it over to Becky Senf.
Great, thank you. So let me share my screen. I already kind of had to be, oh, hang on. All right, are we good? Excellent, thank you. So I'm imagining that for FotoFika, having me talk about this cake project is something of an experiment. And so I'm sure that they're going to want feedback from you all about whether or not this is bonkers and you want people to talk about food less than I'm going to today, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to talk about this cake a week project I did. And it all started in 2013 when I made myself a birthday cake. It was a Mexican chocolate cake with vanilla frosting. And it made me realize that I had a repertoire of like 5 cakes. I considered myself a pretty good baker, but I really had a very limited repertoire. And so this was one of them, this German chocolate cake, which was my then husband's favorite cake and what I always made him for his birthday. And I had a vegan chocolate cake, a white cake, a cranberry almond coffee cake, and then a basic chocolate cake. And my feeling was if I was making a cake for someone, I didn't want to experiment. I didn't want to try something new. I wanted to make sure that I was going to make them a cake that they really liked and that I could be proud of. And so I had this idea that if I made this assignment and tried a new cake a week for a year, that would help me expand my repertoire. And that really is where I started. I decided to do a blog because that seemed like a good way to keep track of the project and my progress. And then I could have photos and recipes. And that was seemed like a good way to organize it. It really wasn't, I wasn't trying to attract an audience. I rarely shared the blog posts to my social media, for instance. It was mostly about keeping track of what I was doing. But I did write in the very first blog post that the point was, I said, to let you know what I'm learning. And I thought it was all going to be learning about baking and about cakes. And that is primarily what I wrote about, but I don't think that is what I actually gained from doing the project. So I'm going to go through some of the cakes, and I hope that you've all had lunch, because as I was preparing this and looking at all these cakes, it made me very hungry. And it's only a little after lunchtime here. But we're going to talk about cakes. And I'm going to go through some of the lessons I learned. And then at the end, I'm going to relate that to my professional work. And this is not a long presentation. It's maybe another 10 minutes or something. And then I'm happy to answer questions and we can have a nice discussion. So one of the first things that I learned is that things are going to go wrong. So this was an Irish whiskey cake. Looks fine from the outside, but you can see from the slice, all the dried fruit that I put in it sank to the bottom, which then when you cut a slice of a bundt cake, that's all at the top. And so there were some good learnings that came out of that. One is that it's not the end of the world it's not a crisis if all your fruit is in one part of the cake. Actually, people still eat it. They're still pretty happy with it. But I think much more importantly, the lesson in that was that I couldn't control what people think, which is kind of a meta lesson. But this idea, part of my assignment to myself was that I served the cakes that I baked. So I would make them, you know, sometimes we would have them at home first and I'd have a chance to taste them, but very often I served them at dinner parties or I brought them to work. And so I wasn't able to judge for myself if this met some kind of imagined standard of my ability of baking before I served it. And letting go of that and feeling like I needn't worry about how I was being judged, or perhaps more importantly, that you can't control how people will judge you, was really a very profound learning that came out of this. The good news is that when you're baking cakes, usually the way that you're being judged isn't whether or not you're a good baker. People tend to find you, you know, they're happy. When they see somebody coming with cake, people tend to be pretty happy. So I think ultimately I was judged for being kind of generous, that there were always these cakes around being shared. But again, even more importantly, that you can't control how people perceive you. So after just a few weeks of working on the project and having some cakes go sideways when I tried to experiment with things I wasn't very familiar with, I began to get anxious. And so this cake, which is where the drawing for today's meeting came from, thank you, Alana, for making my cake look so special. This is actually one of those 5 cakes that was in my repertoire. This is, Moosewood calls it a Red Devil chocolate cake. In my family, we always call it the beet cake because the secret ingredient is a can of pureed beets, and it makes the cake really moist and incredibly delicious. So after doing these new cakes, I decided that I wanted to be back on familiar ground and make a cake that I knew how to make. And so I did that. And I actually think that was a really smart thing to do. It gave me a little reassurance. It gave me back some confidence that I do know what I'm doing. I know how to make a really good cake. Part of why I love this picture are the mini marshmallows, because I didn't want it decorated with mini marshmallows, but my kids were still little at this time. My daughter was 4 and my son was 7. And they wanted to decorate it with mini marshmallows. And I managed to sit on my hands and let them do it, even though that wasn't what I wanted. And gave me a good sense that when you're working on something like cake, and probably is also true for art, that you want it to be joyful, and that it's actually possible to take the joy out of it if you over control, or if you're too rigid in what you think is possible. And so I like this picture because it's like evidence that I managed to actually control my desire to be in control and to be precise, which is part of what I like about baking, and just go with it. This orange cornmeal cake coincides in the blog with a moment where I, even early on, I don't know, 6 or 7 weeks in, was beginning to see the benefit of practice, weekly practice. And it's such a basic premise. We all know it's true. The more you do a thing, the better you get. The faster you get, the better you get, the more confident you get. And it was remarkable how quickly that was apparent. I was getting to a point where I could just pull things together faster, and I was getting some basic skills, getting better at the craft of baking. And that was very good to be reminded of. Okay, this chocolate sour cream bundt cake with orange chocolate ganache glaze was one where I think about patience as part of what I was learning. So again, I mentioned that my kids were little, and so they, of course, thought a cake project was really exciting and they wanted to participate. But as I said, part of what I liked about baking was the precision and the control and the way in which it tested my ability to do exactly what I was supposed to do. And when you're working with little kids, that's not the way things go. So, you know, my son here on the right, you know, mixing and like knocking ingredients out of the bowl, or the kind of gross motor skills that they were both learning as they tried to learn to frost. You know, you forget that kids just can't do some of these things quite the same way. But it was really good practice for me to let go and to be patient and to see the happiness that it was bringing them to participate, and again, to let go of my expectations of what things would be. And I feel like when you look at a picture like this with those chubby fingers and you can't help but be happy and know that that's better than having a perfectly frosted cake every time. So another thing it allowed me to do was face my fears. I feel ridiculous saying this, but this flourless chocolate cake required folding in whipped egg whites. And I was terrified. And I know that it's like absurd to say that you're terrified to make a cake with whipped egg whites, but I was, because I was worried about doing it wrong. And I knew that when you fold in egg whites, there's a special way you're supposed to do it. You're trying to not deflate all of the lift that you've gotten in your whipped egg whites. And I hated the idea that I'd do it wrong and I wouldn't know that I was doing it wrong. So anyway, part of having this kind of an assignment was that I was forced. I chose things that I knew were outside of what I was familiar with, that I had been afraid to do before, and then pushed my way through it. And this flourless chocolate cake was a really good example of the benefits of doing that. It came out beautifully. It was really delicious. Another thing is that doing all of this practice gives you confidence. So this black mocha cake with vanilla whipped cream filling and coffee buttercream frosting was a moment where my baking really leveled up. And it was a multi-day cake. So I baked the cakes on one day, made the filling and assembled it a second day, and then froze it. On a third day, I made the frosting and frosted it, and then chilled the whole cake before it was served. This was for my mom's 71st birthday. And, you know, it felt really good to realize that I had made progress. I was in a different place than I was when I had started, even if that place just came from having the confidence to try something new. And it was, again, well, pretty delicious cake, pretty good result. Oh, and actually I missed one because I didn't have a slide of it. So I'll tuck it in here. I was also building intuition. You know, all of that practice, you start to realize when things are wrong through your intuition. So the reason I don't have a picture of the red velvet cake with mascarpone cream cheese frosting is that I served it. It was so terrible that I threw it in the trash after dinner. But the reason it's related to intuition is that from the moment that it wasn't ready when the recipe said it should be after 30 minutes in the oven, I knew something was wrong. And I turned the cakes out and they seemed too crumbly, and I frosted them and served them, but it was clear that it was off. And so that's another thing that all of that practice does for you, is you start to have a sense and recognize when things are not right. And that, I think, can be almost the most valuable thing that comes out of practice, more than getting faster, is that you can recognize when things are going wrong and correct, or, you know, I probably should have thrown the cake in the trash before I served it and started over. Okay, this cake comes with the idea of the value of being vulnerable, also relates to being judged. And I want to read something I wrote at that time. As I made 2 cakes this afternoon, I reflected on the idea that not only am I practicing making cakes, I'm practicing trying something new. I used to be a basket case if I was serving something I'd never made before to guests. Tonight, I explained the cake project, which does act as something of a disclaimer, but then I felt assured that we'd try the cakes, we might like them, we might not, but the uncertainty of it doesn't upset me the way it once did. It's a powerful thing, getting used to not being sure. This gluten-free gingerbread cake goes along with the idea of the value of making things and the way in which we make things and put ourselves into them and invest those things with the people for whom we make them, or maybe who they're about. So in this case, this cake was for a dear friend of mine who was moving away from Tucson. She was throwing an open house to say goodbye to people. And I thought a lot about that idea that as I made it, it was for her and it was full of my love for her. And it actually led me to feel like from that point on, when I went into like a grocery store and you'd see all the cakes in the bakery section, I started to call those stranger cakes because they're not for someone, they're made by a baker for strangers, and how much more important it is when we make things that contain something of ourselves and that becomes part of the product. So let me tie this into my own work. So I'm showing on the screen on the left, my book that came out last year, Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams. This year of making a cake a week and this self-assignment totally had an echo when I was working on the book. I definitely had moments of sincere fear and panic when I was writing this book. It was the biggest thing I'd ever done. It represents 17 years of research. And when you're fearful and panicking, it's pretty hard to write. It's pretty hard to make progress. And so it was in those moments that I had to recognize that I had a practice. My practice is research, writing, and revision, and that I needed to trust the practice, and that was the way I was going to get through the fear and the panic. I just needed to know that I had a process and that the process was going to see me through those rough patches. And I mean, and it did. And then on the right is the advertisement for the online exhibition I did for Art Photo Index, API, that was called Not My Family Values. It was the first online exhibition I did. And again, I was terrified of the way in which I was going to be evaluated and judged. This first online exhibition was going to circulate in a way other exhibitions of mine hadn't. And so knowing that you couldn't control how you were going to be judged, and you needed to, that being vulnerable was a place of real value and growth, helped me move through, even as I was very concerned and anxious. Okay, I want to read one last quote from the blog. The biggest lesson of this year's worth of baking is that having a hobby, something other than the work I love, to distract me and give my downtime some direction and sense of productivity, creates more balance than anything else I've experienced. Baking cakes with the structure of this year-long project and blog has had an amazingly positive effect on my life. Thanks. So I'll come back and we can have a chat.
Thank you. So, yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca.
Yeah. So I have a question. What made you give yourself this assignment?
I mean, it really started out as just wanting to have a bigger repertoire of cakes that I could bake. But I think there was also a piece of it, you know, as a mom with young kids, and at the time I was married, and I had this busy job that required me to travel and took me away. In part, it was giving myself permission to do something for myself. That making it a project, making it an assignment, meant that I could say, okay, on the weekend, I'm going to shop for the ingredients, and then I'm going to make the cake, and I can't not do it. And, you know, there were all of these things pulling at me in different directions. And I think I was needing, in some ways, to stake out some time for myself. And that was not premeditated. I didn't know that I was doing that. But as I went along, and it was so pleasurable to do it, and it was hard to continue to find the time to do it, it made me realize that having made it formal helped me continue to give myself that time.
That's good. I think, I mean, some of the questions that we're starting to try to provoke here right now too is putting structures on things. And so I think it's a great example of that. I'm also struck by how you said the idea of making something was important. But if other people have questions, I don't need to jump in and dominate.
Are we jumping in or using the chat?
Yes.
You can
totally
jump in.
Yeah, because that was something I wanted to ask you about, this idea. I mean, the parallels between making art and cakes is interesting. I mean, making, I guess, the art of cakes, but the idea of structure and process and the handmade. So could you talk a little bit about that? Like how, if I know you started this project much earlier than the pandemic, but how the process of making something by hand and then applying structure, process, calendar helps or helped you get through a difficult period, or if you can imagine that applied to, I'm all things being seen through the lens of the pandemic right now, but maybe discuss that idea of the handmade.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I think that in many ways, what made it so successful was the structure, was the kind of the routine of it, the repetition, the kind of limitations and parameters, and I totally underestimated the value of it when I started. That having it, I mean, and then of course you can think it makes sense once you've done it, right? Like I told people I'm doing this cake project, and then people ask you, how's the cake project going? And it keeps you accountable in a way that's pleasurable, that you feel like you've made this commitment to yourself, but then you uphold it because you believe in this thing that I mean, I just made it up. It wasn't like somebody gave me the idea or gave me the assignment, but having the assignment held me to it in a really valuable way. And you hear that about other things, about weight loss or about quitting smoking, that having a community, being accountable, that you should share that goal, it helps. And that was definitely true. And I appreciate your point about the calendar, that, I've heard this about goal setting, when they talk about it at New Year's, right? That you shouldn't set the goal to write a novel. You should set the goal to write a certain number of hours a week or a certain number of days a week, because you can't actually achieve the goal of writing a novel if you can't meet the goal of that regular practice. And so I think you're right. Having it be a weekly thing meant I only ever needed to accomplish 1 week's goal, and that I could always manage to do. That wasn't too overwhelming, and that made the whole thing achievable. And the handmade thing, I actually think is huge. I mean, it helps. It occupies you. So, I'm a creative person. I'm a curator. I mean, a lot of what I do is create. But there's something about the cake where I'm following a recipe, but the whole time I'm doing it, I'm investing myself in that process. I mean, it's this, I've knit baby blankets too, and I think of that as very analogous. Every stitch is about your love for the family that's having the baby, and that's what makes a baby blanket significant. So for me, that was really important, that it got my hands going, and it allowed me to think in all kinds of unstructured ways that my busy life at that moment wasn't allowing me to do. And so, yeah, I think the handmade component of it was critical. But for me in particular, the fact that it was cooking, baking, was also fulfilling a nurturing impulse as well. And so for me, that combination of the handmade and the nurturing was very satisfying.
Thank you. Yeah, I can imagine like the immediacy too. I mean, making a cake certainly is different than a calendar of a 3-year exhibition schedule.
Yeah.
So, but thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
And then I think
Jason.
Yeah. Hey, Jason.
Hi, Becky, this is something we've talked about before, but did you need sort of special time set aside to do baking, or did you feel like you could multitask it with taking care of children, with doing other things, or was there a totally different experience when you were alone doing it versus doing it amidst all the other action that was happening around you?
Yeah, I mean, so my kids were young enough that there was an element of defining time and setting aside time. And if I'm honest, some pressure and what's the right word? Like disapproval from my husband at the time, who felt like this was frivolous and I didn't deserve the time, and it was an imposition on him and was negatively impacting him. And there's a whole separate lecture about the personal things I learned through this cake making process,
I'm sure,
which are significant. You know, there was a lot that I came to by putting the pressures of a project about myself into my life. It was, you know, I learned a lot about that. I mean, usually I did the baking by myself. And very often, you know, I would run out to the grocery store and get ingredients, and that was time that I could have by myself. And then often the kids wanted to come in on the decorating, which, you know, was where then I had to resist the temptation to control it all. Although that wedding cake that I showed in the last picture, like nobody was getting near it. It really did matter to me that I did it all myself, and that it reflected, and it was a disaster. I mean, anybody who looked closely at it could see all the ways in which I didn't know what I was doing, and I made a kind of a mess of it.
For an actual wedding?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I had friends who had been married in a private ceremony, and then when gay marriage became legal, this was before the Supreme Court decision, they went to California to get officially married, but weren't planning a celebration back in Tucson. So we hosted a celebration, and I offered to make a cake, and they wanted a 3-tiered vanilla white wedding cake. And so that's what I made. Yeah, for an actual wedding. But yeah, I think in retrospect, it was really valuable that my kids understood that this was a thing I was doing. I was doing it for myself, and that I deserved the time to do it. Mm-hmm. And my son was so proud of it. He told everyone. He would tell teachers. I mean, anyone he could tell about, he would. And so I think that was a really important lesson.
So it's interesting. I'm trying to correlate some of the things that we're talking about with you here, Becky, and then some of the things. There's so much about how FotoFika sort of came into existence. You know, yeah, 18 months ago, I think all of us probably, you know, were sitting alone in offices, and we probably could have worked through the iterative practice, and we probably could have troubleshooted all of the needs for a class. But the actual group dynamic of FotoFika really was to, you know, to in fact be vulnerable with one another, have that level of uncertainty with one another, and also give over to each other some of the parts of the process, and that we didn't all have all of the answers, and so collectively we might be able to bring some of those things to the forefront and try to solve them. And you know, I love the idea of thinking about, you know, each contribution, each hand that is contributing to those cakes having significance, regardless of whether they were the perfect or the most pristine or the most whatever. That, you know, what it is that we're all doing here together is, you know, we're all contributing in the capacity that we have. And we're all then gifted with the idea of progressing together. And that to me is, you know, it's a nice correlation.
And, you know, and one of the things you talked about too, in terms of having this structured in 52 weeks, right? Like I was thinking about like you know, if we look at it just semesters as educators, like that's kind of where we're at. We're at the 52 week mark of COVID-19, right? And you know, part of the thinking that we have around the cookbook project essentially is like, you know, have we reached a stage of mastery around those things that we have to deal with to a point where, you know, one of the definitions of, I mean, I sent the definition of a fika. It comes from, it's a Swedish custom of people at around 4 o'clock or at 3 o'clock, stepping away from their desks and going and having coffee with their colleagues and having, you know, a sweet or something or a piece of cake or whatever the case may be, to like be that break so that we can interact and engage and not be, you know, task oriented and focused specifically on the thing. So one of the things that I also heard Becky talk about is the idea of the whole person, right? That we all have all of these obligations, and you know, there's a group of people that over the course of the 52 weeks of COVID have joined us here to spend some time with us, to share their expertise, to share their lectures, to share their YouTube videos. So, you know, part of the thinking around, you know, moving forward is this idea is that we want to be kind of intentional about getting together, but we also want to make sure that we have time to be together, right? Which I think is some of the things that people have talked about when we started this, is that it was an opportunity for us to actually see each other and be in the same place with each other, and be able to you know, engage with each other in a way that's you know, not exactly programmed, right? So, and that's part of the thing that we're thinking about here, is that we're going to try and be pretty concise with our guests, so that, you know, if you watch after the fact or you miss it, you can see our guest. And then the other piece of what we want to do is to be able to engage with each other.
I want to jump in here too a little bit about the relationship between food and photography, but also the ability to share food being something that we lost during the pandemic, or have lost. And I think, you know, Becky, you talk about cooking being connected to nurturing, and I think one of the things that we come back to too in teaching, I mean, nurturing, I don't want to, you know, overemphasize that we, you know, but I think that idea of figuring out ways to give, or ways to express things. And my son, during the first week the pandemic happened, he was a senior in high school, and one of his teachers had them each assign them to cook something. And it was such a beautiful assignment. And I mean, you know, thinking back to the very beginning of the pandemic and things that touched us. And I only recently remembered that, but I just remember thinking my kid was going to be okay, you know, when he cooked. But I think the interesting thing, you know, we can talk about these relationships between food and photography, but also food and socializing. And John, you know, the idea of fika and the idea of sharing food, but then what are all these things that we get from food and from the processes, and what can we share virtually when we're not together? I mean, I can tell you, we are planning a FotoFika at SPE where we're going to have tons of food and be in real life someday. I really want that to happen. But anyway, just triggered, you know, Becky, your talk triggered a lot of thoughts about some of the things that we can get or we can provide for ourselves, or ways in which we can connect. Anyway, just some thoughts about all these ideas that are coming out about processes and what we learn through processes, but also these connections that we make. So that's just my little spiel about the relationship between all these things.
Well, Betsy, though, that makes me think about for you all as teachers, and I'm sure that this came up over your discussions over the last year, but that part of what we've all had to do is figure out how to convey the intent or the meaning of the message, even if the form of the message had to change, right? You can't cook for somebody now. You can't bring baked goods to your office for the break room. How do you convey your concern for your colleagues in a different way? How do you all as instructors convey that nurturing to your students when the ways that you might have felt most comfortable doing it before aren't available to you anymore? How do we make sure that we continue to be all the parts of who we are professionally and personally, having had a bunch of our tools taken away from us?
I think Barbara Bosworth is in the audience. For Barbara, it's how do you share the chocolate? But yeah.
I think that would be the same for Jeannie Pierce too, by the way, since Be Proud is here, and I know how I was schooled on the importance of chocolate. And so Barbara, good one. So one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of thinking for our future, FotoFika, thinking about this idea of crowdsourcing a book with you all, the idea of collecting what has been the last, let's call it 3 terms of FotoFika, right? We have our immediate reactionary call to action in early March of 2020. We panic, we collect things together, we crowdsource the work, we put together every resource and reference we can possibly come up with. We establish lists of labs that are going to stay open, who's going to be able to do what, and we share that, right? And that's, that's one form of the formulas, it's one form of the ingredients, it's one form of the recipes. And then we transitioned a little bit to, how do we both celebrate and activate and respond more responsibly in a time when things still feel incredibly tenuous, and how do we make the old recipes, for example, of our classrooms, the old assignments, the way that we did things in the before, how do we make them as effective in this online modality, right? And then we continued with that, with really thinking about some of the more grander support structures, the things that were actually holding us up as an institution, the complications and difficult discussions that we were having about academia and photo education in particular, and in this place that still felt very fragile last spring. And here we are, many of us for the first time returning to our classrooms. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is that this time, this very important historical time, provided content that has the potential of being more evasive than the typical ephemera because it existed in this space, right? And so one of the reasons that the book format for me was so important is it's the logging of, it's the grandmother's recipe, it's the handing down from one generation to the next. And it's all those things that we all incorporated into, incorporated into our very important curriculums and very important classroom dynamics. And so for me, that was one of the things that was so exciting about thinking about, how do we as a group potentially write a book about both the COVID time, but also all of those lessons, all of those quote unquote recipes that are carrying us forward.
I love that thought, Anne, too. I think not just to kind of take off or just reflect on something that you said too about this this 2-year moment, but also this idea of it being a little bit ephemeral and already forgetting. I mean, just what I said about my son doing that recipe, and not that we have to remember every single moment, but I do think that the conversations we've had here and the ideas that have come out have been, you know, there's been some really interesting things that I feel like I still can't keep track of everything that I've kind of learned, and not necessarily that we have this idea that we want to collect everything, or I think the risk also is starting to feel nostalgic about a moment that we're in already, and this weird total self-analysis or constant analysis of the moment. I think I read the New York Times too much because that is like all they're about, feels like. But I do think thinking about strategies that we're learning, and as we're going forward, actually not forgetting, that sounds kind of silly, but as we go, you know, emerge into something that's more new normal. Anyway, there's just some thoughts about that. But I mean, I think one of the things that we wanted to throw out there today too was kind of a sense of what other people need. Like what's going on. I think when FotoFika very first started, it was so intense and it was so immediate. And I think now I feel like we're all kind of missing the connections that we had 2 years ago, but we're in this like kind of in between space. So one thing I'd be interested in throwing out to all of you is kind of thoughts about, yes, I want you to think of recipes, and I want those old family recipes. And I learned to make a mean margarita during COVID, but what, you know, also what, you know, what's missing right now, or what's, you know, what do we need right now from each other that we might not be getting because we're not, you know, there are very few fall conferences, you know, it's still we're still not totally normal. So that's just something I want to throw out there to people and start that conversation. Yeah. You can think about it for a few minutes.
Can anybody think of a recipe that they'd want to share? Not that you would have to share at this moment, but we'll be collecting them over the course of this year.
I do. I have 2 recipes. One is a tofu recipe. Everybody says I hate tofu, but they love my tofu.
Fantastic.
And another one is that I've been coffee toning photographs with, I've been coffee toning pigment prints, and then reversing that acid using Alka-Seltzer.
Fantastic.
And it's acid neutral, and everybody is interested in what that process is. So I could share that process.
Yeah, we would. That's a perfect kind of example of the kinds of things that we're looking at, because we want to include, you know, both photographic processes, life processes, and definitely food processes.
So when Rebecca was doing her presentation, it made me think of something I kind of related to during the pandemic. So to like de-stress and escape, I would watch a lot of Great British Bake Off. And the people on that show are just so genuine and pure, and they always have a great relationship with food, except when it's the host's recipes, and they're always like, so one of the recipes that they gave, the challenge was Monet's favorite cake, which I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, Le Gâteau Vert. And I saw it and I was like, I want to make that. It took 6 hours and I couldn't get all of the ingredients. So I threw in different ones, but it ended up tasting amazing, even though it looked terrible. And I probably cried like twice while I was making it, but maybe an adapted recipe.
That's great. I can see that scene, and I can hear what that guy would say. Oh, flavor's good, but anyway.
Presentation's off. Like as soon as you showed the bundt cake with the fruit at the bottom, I was like, oh, she didn't flour the fruit, just from watching that show.
That's exactly right. That's what I learned.
Leslie, do you want to talk a little bit about that article that you posted?
Sure. It's sort of related to, I think, what we're all trying to put a finer point on, but it's about what the pandemic is doing to our brains. And a lot of it is about memory. And I mean, we're all told to, really, give a lot of leniency to our students, but also I think as educators and in other fields, we're struggling too, and I think that something that where we have something that is hands-on, as well as the idea, if it's already sounds like this project is going to engage the ideas of memory, I think it would be very fruitful for all of us. But I highly recommend it if you're still feeling a little swimmy. You are not alone. You are not alone.
Great. Thank you. That's, yeah. Swimmy. I like that swimmy idea.
And we have kind of we've got about 6 minutes left. And one thing that Anne is very good at is that FotoFika does not go longer than an hour. So if you join us, you don't have to worry about things going much, much longer. I do want to, one of the things that we've been thinking about is, we're trying to build structure around what FotoFika is and what this project is and how we're going to structure it. And one of the guides we're using is the 1964 edition of The Joy of Cooking, which has instructions on how to dress a squirrel and all kinds of random things. But we're loosely basing the structure for FotoFika over this coming year based on their chapter headings. So I wanted to share those with you just to have a thought of, and we'll continue to share stuff through the blog and as we invite you to things as a prompt for some of the things that we're going to be talking about. But one of the main sections is know your ingredients, and that's the theme for this week and the next visitor, and that's why we brought Becky in. There's a heading that's called the food we eat, right? Which there's a lot of different metaphors that are connect to that. The food we heat. So about the processing and the ingredients, but also the making and that, and then the foods we keep is also one of the things. So there's this particular chapter this particular book has, I think it has like, oh my God, it has some really amazing things in it. But that's what we're working from loosely, and we don't know what our book will be called, but we have ideas. But the structure is basically around the chapter headings and section headings of the 1964 edition of The Joy of Cooking, which is it's also the year that SPE was founded. So we're thinking about our relationship to food and photography and all things, all things.
So with that in mind, part of the reason we've moved to a monthly structure is that we wanted to make sure that there was time for also the pre-work of a meeting, right? We were flying by the seat of our pants most weeks, sometimes not getting you content until the day before. And so with this in mind, we're gonna provide you those chapter headings, give you guys some time to really think about this so that when you join us, there really is this opportunity for more of a real conversation.
And I just want to tag on to that too, because I've just already noticed in the chat, there's a lot going on. And I love this kind of a little bit of brainstorming. I think that's great. One of the things I think we've probably all noticed, those of us who are in that photography professors Facebook page, is there's certain people, I think people want to give. They want to give a lot of advice, and that forum is great in a lot of ways, but I think being able to give advice and then have a little bit more conversation about it will be great. So this idea of continue your brainstorming, and as Anne says, we're going to have more time building up to each session. So you know, send us your ideas and your brainstorms, and then come and be ready to talk about them.
Right. So obviously we do want to thank Becky for being our first guest and for being so open and sharing with us her project. John has dropped the email address for anybody who wants to share ideas with us sooner rather than later. One of the things that I think is really important for us in this particular round is really, again, embracing the idea of the community. So as I said at the beginning, this is a two-parter introduction from the standpoint of really wanting to get as many of the FotoFika community, SPE community, photo educators, the photo professors, Facebook community to be at this table. So please do share. We will be doing a social media push that really engages the project more fully. But really want to thank you guys for being here, and you know, best of luck in this fall term.
Yes. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, everyone.